guys, welcome back to my channel. This is Cruel Intentions, a true crime channel. I am Holly, and with every video I take you on a journey throughout Australian true crime history. If you're interested in Australian true crime and you love an occasional background reshuffle, then consider subscribing. Or don't. I'm not here to tell you what to do, I'm not your real mum, and I never will be. So today we're talking about Australia's Pickaxe or Ice Pick Killer. It's a shorter video just because there isn't a lot of information out there around the case. But before we do jump into it, just to let you know, this case will involve sexual assault, suicide, and it will also discuss the murder and attempted murder of a child. So if that all sounds like something you're not into, that's totally fine. I will see you on the next one. In May of 1989, Mary Alice Clark's body was discovered by her husband, Grant. She had been viciously attacked in their bedroom. Her hands and feet had been bound, she was gagged, and she was barely alive. As he rushed to get his wife into the car to take her to hospital, he found their 1-year-old son Samuel under heavy blankets that had been thrown over him. Mary Alice Clark was pronounced dead at the hospital only minutes later. She had been killed by multiple head wounds, delivered by what the detectives guessed was a pickaxe. Investigators would not be able to pinpoint a suspect until over 2 months later, when another woman, Ruth Ferguson, was found by her husband in the boot of the car, bound and gagged with multiple head injuries. Ruth was already dead when her husband Greg found her, partially dressed and stuffed into the trunk of her own vehicle. Lying next to her, also deceased, was their 8-month-old son Mark, found with rope and his bib tied tightly around his neck. Baby Mark had died of strangulation, but Ruth Ferguson had died from head wounds delivered by a particular weapon that had also been found inside the car's boot. It was a mountain climber's pickaxe. Detectives would link both families to one suspect in particular, 28-year-old Paul Gerald Mason. So, let's go back to the beginning. On Friday, May the 12th, 1989, Grant Clark went to work, and on this particular day he was building window frames. He owned and operated his own home renovation business, running it from the Clark's farming property called Oakdale in Gundaroo Road, about 30 kilometres north of Canberra. His wife, Mary Alice Clark, was preparing for their son Samuel's first birthday party. Mary's friends from church had arrived in the morning to help her with the party arrangements, cooking food, helping to clean up, and then all praying together. When they left, Mary went out to help her husband before returning to their farm cottage to bake Samuel's birthday cake. At about 2:40 p.m, Grant arrived back at the cottage to check on his wife and son. Samuel had just gone down for his afternoon nap, and Grant told Mary to rest for a while he went to pick up a ride-on mower from Mary's brother Ian. Ian Cusack lived about 4 kilometres away on a neighbouring farming property. Mary's family owned around 2,000 acres of property divided into Oakdale, where Mary and Grant lived, and Bywong, where Ian Cusack resided. Grant got into his Mitsubishi Star Wagon and left for Ian's house after stopping multiple times to open and close gates along the way. He ended up getting there about 20 minutes later, at about 3 p.m. He loaded the mower onto the trailer attached to his car and then wandered around the homestead to look at some new paintwork that Ian was having done. He didn't stay long, just had a peek at the painter that was still working on the exterior of the house. Between 3 and 3:15 p.m, he left to head back to the home to get the yard and the property grounds looking neat and tidy before their son's party began that evening. He got back home about another 20 minutes later, and after unloading the mower, he entered the cottage to find it quiet. He went into his and Mary's bedroom, expecting to find her still having a rest before their families arrived. What he found when he walked in, though, was Mary's lifeless body, partially covered with a blanket, covered in blood, with her hands and feet bound and her mouth gagged. She was unconscious but still alive. Grant did have some first aid training, so after cutting her bindings, he carefully moved his wife into the coma position. He ran outside to the van, disconnected the trailer attached to it, ran back inside, and began to carry Mary's body down so he could put it in the car. He had heard a faint cry from his son's room and found 1-year-old Samuel covered in large, heavy blankets, struggling to breathe. Grant rushed his wife and son to the Canberra Royal Hospital. He didn't stop for the gates on the way this time, he just crashed right through them in an effort to get to medical help as soon as he possibly could. Oakdale was an isolated farming property and the hospital was over half an hour away. Mary Alice Clark was pronounced dead on arrival at 4:15 p.m. Baby Samuel survived his ordeal, but his mother had been killed. When guests began arriving at Grant and Mary's home for Samuel's birthday party, they immediately realised that something was terribly wrong. Mary's brother Ian, her sister-in-law Felicity, Felicity's 3 children, and Mary's parents, Marie and John Cusack, yes, his name is John Cusack, but not that John Cusack, all arrived at around the same time, and when they entered the house and looked for Mary, Grant, and Samuel, they saw the extensive amount of blood in the bedroom. They thought that perhaps Mary had tragically suffered a miscarriage, because Mary was 11 weeks pregnant with her second child. Now, Mary and Grant's families didn't know which of the 3 Canberra hospitals Grant might have taken her to, so they split up and each went to one. Mary's parents, Marie and John, were the ones that ended up arriving at the Canberra Royal Hospital to find their daughter dead from extensive head trauma. Meanwhile, Detective Sergeant Leonard Len Dean arrived at the Clark home and started to search the residence. In the Clark's bedroom, he found a blood-stained mattock handle, a spanner, and a large knife. Photographs were taken of the crime scene and the house was fingerprinted from top to bottom. A post-mortem examination of Mary Alice revealed that her cause of death was brain injuries inflicted by a heavy, sharp object. She had been forcibly struck in the head by this instrument 5 times, twice to the back of her head and 3 times to the forehead above her left eye. Initially, Detective Sergeant Dean thought that the mattock handle could have been the murder weapon, but the injury pattern didn't match. Police and homicide squad units searched the farmland, the cottage, nearby dams, and even the septic tank, but the murder weapon could not be located. Now, forensic testing in Australia had only been used for 2.5 years, so it wasn't sophisticated enough to provide any results from the scene, and press releases asking for the public to help wasn't providing any leads because Mary and Grant Clark's cottage was so isolated. Grant himself immediately became a suspect, as do most spouses when someone is murdered. He went through hours of questioning and interviews, outlining his movements over that day, where he was, what he'd been doing, when he left, but his story never wavered and was backed up by multiple witnesses, including Ian Cusack, who had seen him picking up the mower, the painter that had been at Ian's house, and even a salesman from a company that pumps out septic tanks who had stopped by the farmhouse earlier in the day on May the 12th. The salesman remembers waving to Mary as he left and seeing her wave politely back to him. Mary's family supported Grant 100% and knew that he would never hurt Mary and that there was no way he was guilty of harming his wife and the unborn child that she was carrying. They knew how much Grant and Mary loved each other and how much they loved being with each other. They would often go bushwalking together or else head out mountaineering, Grant being an avid rock climber. Mary had been a nurse in Sydney when they had met, and after a few years of dating, they married in August of 1987. They hadn't been married 2 years when Mary was ruthlessly killed. The police, after reviewing the details of Grant's interviews and statements, had no other choice but to rule him out as a suspect. His version of events held up, and all of his movements could be accounted for. At Mary's funeral, her family and friends remembered her as an open and outgoing person, someone who was prepared to offer people her time and advice. Her father described her as one of the very few people that he knew as truly humble. Her family were devastated by her death. She was the eldest of 7 children, and the Cusack family were well loved and respected by the community in Canberra. They owned a number of furniture shops in the city, and they had for years. And they also developed the Cusack Centre, blocks of commercial offices which now house retail stores, cafes, dance and fitness studios, and is also home to the studios of Canberra and Region Designers in Fashion, or Cardiff Collective, a not-for-profit organisation that provides studios and assistance to budding fashion designers. So they definitely left their mark on the Canberra community. Now, the detectives investigating the brutal murder of Mary Alice Clark would not have another suspect until over 2 months later, when they were called out to a property in Calgoa Crescent, Pambula Beach, about 3 to 4 hours south of the Oakdale cottage. Greg Ferguson was a 26-year-old schoolteacher who lived in Pambula Beach with his wife Ruth and their 8-month-old baby Mark. Greg returned home from work at about 5 p.m. on Thursday the 27th of July to find his home empty and a note taped to the front door which said, "Had to go out, back late afternoon, sorry." Greg Ferguson knew that his wife Ruth was supposed to meet a neighbour for a game of tennis earlier that morning, and when questioned, the neighbour said that she'd come to get Ruth, had seen the note on the door, and had just left, thinking that Ruth must have had to go out. And as far as Greg could see, she had gone out because she was nowhere in the house. But Ruth's car was still there, and when Greg looked closer, he noticed blood on her vehicle at the back, so he unlocked the boot. Inside the boot of her own car was Ruth Ferguson, partially undressed, with her hands and feet tied, tape over her mouth, and extensive head wounds. Greg and Ruth's 8-month-old son Mark was lying next to his mother, with rope tied around his neck, along with a tightly wrapped bib. Both Ruth and Mark were dead, horrifically murdered and hidden in the boot of Ruth's own car. When the police arrived, they secured the area and Greg was taken to make a statement. When officers searched the boot of the vehicle, they found a mountain climber's pickaxe next to the body. It was covered in blood, and it was consistent with the injuries that Ruth Ferguson had sustained to her head, which had caused her death, while Mark Ferguson's cause of death was ruled as strangulation. When detectives found the pickaxe, it confirmed to them that they might now be dealing with a serial killer. Missing from Grant and Mary Alice Clark's shed, when searched by investigators 2 months beforehand, was a mountain climber's pickaxe. It was no coincidence that the wounds on both Mary and Ruth were similar both in pattern and location, and that they both happened to involve such an obscure murder weapon. They still hadn't found the pickaxe at the Clark residence and surrounding areas, but the circumstances were eerily similar. Greg Ferguson told police that earlier that day, as he was leaving for work, an old school friend of his wife's had arrived at the house. Greg stopped to say hello but couldn't stay chatting long and left his wife and son to entertain their guest. Paul Gerald Mason had gone to school with Ruth, and his sister had even been bridesmaid at Ruth and Greg's wedding, so Greg Ferguson had no reason to worry when he left the house that morning. Mason was the last person to see Ruth and Mark Ferguson alive, and information about another link to Mary Clark's murder was being discovered. Grant Clark loved to rock climb, and while sometimes he and Mary would go out together, he often met with a friend who seemed to share his passion for the adventure sport. This friend was Paul Gerald Mason. On an occasion months before Mary had been murdered, Mason had found himself alone with her and had made some sexual advances towards her. Mary had immediately rejected them and informed her husband, who had confronted Mason, and the men had argued. And since then, Paul Mason had been living in Sydney. Now, detectives realised that this could be a potential motive. Perhaps Paul Mason was angry that he'd been rejected by Mary Clark. Detectives knew that when Mary Clark's body had been found, there were definite signs of a struggle from the defensive wounds and the state of her clothing. There had been speculation between officers that her killer had tried and failed to sexually assault her before she was killed. They also knew, but had kept out of the media, that Ruth Ferguson had been raped before she was murdered. Could Paul Mason have advanced on Ruth as he had with Mary? Could he have held a grudge against these women who had rejected him? Police weren't able to confirm that this had happened in the case of Ruth Ferguson, but through testing and analysis, they were able to link the pattern of wounds in both victims to the climber's pickaxe. These women had both been killed with this kind of weapon. Not only that, but the weapon used in the murder of Ruth and Mark Ferguson still had the price tag on it and could be traced to a store in Sydney City, and they knew that that's where Paul Mason had been living. That, along with the information that Grant Clark had given them about Paul Mason being a regular visitor to their house and his mountain climbing partner, Paul Mason was now the number one suspect in both the Clark and Ferguson cases. Now, some witnesses came forward and reported seeing a vehicle between 10 a.m. and midday parked at Greg and Ruth Ferguson's home. The description that the witnesses gave matched the description of the car that Mason was reported to have had at the time, a green Mitsubishi Sigma sedan. A police search was conducted in the area and a description of Mason's vehicle was given over the police radios. Now, some of the detectives working on the case thought that Mason might head back to his original murder site, the Clark Cottage at Oakdale, and the following day they enlisted a special weapons and operations squad, a police helicopter, and any other available police resources and began to search the area surrounding the Clark home. They arrived at 9 a.m. and it wasn't long before they came across the green Sigma, bogged near the fence line of the farm. The detective's suspicions that he might return to this scene were confirmed, but the car was empty. Paul Mason had gotten the car stuck and it hadn't been able to free it, so he'd left on foot. 30 to 40 police officers searched the surrounding area until it got dark, but were unable to find Mason. The officers and search team planned to return at 6 a.m. the following morning. Now, by that time, Inspector Harry George of the Queanbeyan Police estimates that Mason could have been 20 hours ahead of police, which would have been plenty enough time for him to get back to Sydney, but he could just as easily be hiding in the area waiting for night to fall before trying to leave. They returned to the spot where Paul Mason had left his vehicle early in the morning of the 29th of July, but they found no further signs of Paul Gerald Mason. Massive search teams went to neighbouring farmhouses to speak to anyone that might have seen someone around their properties. Dwellings and structures on the Clark property were searched, but still nothing was found. An appeal was made through the media by Paul Mason's father, pleading for Paul to hand himself in. Newspaper reports from that day gave some insight into how scared the local community was. Neighbours would rarely speak to police in fear of being the next victim, and if they did, they absolutely refused to give out their names. But they said that mothers were scared to go out alone or with their small children. Some elderly neighbours were staying together instead of alone in their homes, and that they felt sick about the murders, especially the thought that this man had killed an 8-month-old child. But later that same night at 9:35 p.m, less than an hour away from the Clark property, Paul Gerald Mason walked into the Woden police station in Canberra and gave himself up. Maybe he knew that now the police knew who he was, that he wouldn't be able to outrun them, or maybe he just wanted it to be over. Maybe he'd seen his father on TV asking him to stop running. But investigators that interviewed him would later say that he was hungry, he wanted food. He had used the only money he had on fuel for the car 2 days earlier. And that money wasn't even his. The money he'd had at that time was the contents of a purse that he'd stolen from the Ferguson house after viciously killing Ruth and her son Mark. No matter the reason, Paul Mason simply turned himself in for the murders of Mary Alice Clark and Ruth and Mark Ferguson. He was taken first to the Clark's Oakdale farmhouse, where he took detectives to a location about 700 metres from the residence, where under bushes and shrubbery, Mason had hidden the mountain climber's pickaxe, the one that belonged to Grant Clark, and the one that he had used to bludgeon Mary Alice Clark to death. He was then taken to Pembula Beach to depict his movements there on the day that he murdered Ruth and Mark Ferguson. Once he had given detectives this overview of his horrific crimes, police then took him to the Queanbeyan police station to participate in recorded interviews, where he would explain exactly what had happened to all of his victims. Paul Gerald Mason was a 28-year-old unemployed single man living with his father in Riverstone, Sydney. He had one hobby that got him out of the house, and that was mountain climbing. Through a shared interest in the activity, Mason had met Grant Clark, and they had become friendly. They had met on numerous occasions to climb together. Mason would often visit the farmhouse, and he knew both Grant and his wife Mary very well. Mason admitted that he had made unwanted sexual advances towards Mary when he had found himself alone with her, and she had rejected him and had immediately told her husband, which had resulted in the argument that detectives had already been told about. Paul Mason, though, had been thinking about this argument and about how Mary had rejected him for months. He had stewed over this incident and had begun to devise a way to take his revenge on these people who had, in his mind, wronged him in some way. He told police that he had actually planned to murder all three of the Clarks, Grant, Mary, and baby Samuel. He would kill Grant and Samuel first before raping and then killing Mary. Paul Gerald Mason had travelled from Sydney to Canberra on the 11th of May that year. Being experienced in hiking through the bush, he walked the 30 kilometres to the Clarks' farm after arriving to Canberra by train. He got there and hid out in a barn just as the sun was rising on the morning of the 12th. He observed the house for a few hours before grabbing the mountain climber's pickaxe from the hay shed near the house and approaching the back of the property. Mary had just put Samuel down for his afternoon nap, and Grant Clark had just left to pick up the lawnmower from Mary's brother. Paul Mason entered the Clark home through an unlocked back door and snuck up behind Mary while she was tidying up the kitchen. He grabbed her from behind and overpowered her. He quickly bound her hands and feet and gagged her with tea towels from the kitchen, using rope and tape that he'd brought with him. Mason dragged Mary Clark into her own bedroom and threw her on the bed. She was unable to run and couldn't scream through the towels that he had pushed inside her mouth. Paul Mason began trying to undress her, but she struggled wildly and fought back against him. Mason realized that it was going to be too difficult to rape Mary Clark, so he skipped that part of his plan and pulled out the pickaxe. He struck Mary Alice Clark 5 times in the head, 3 times in the forehead above the left eye, and twice in the back of the head as she struggled against her familiar attacker. While Mary Alice Clark was unbelievably still alive immediately after this attack, her wounds would quickly prove fatal for not only her, but the child that she had been pregnant with. Paul Mason then walked into Samuel's room and found the 1-year-old asleep in his bed. He threw a heavy blanket over the child, tucking it in around his head in an attempt to smother him. Now, despite his so-called plan to wait for Grant to return home so he could kill him too, Paul Mason decided to leave. Apparently his victim preferences were only vulnerable women and children. As he left the house, he ripped out the phone lines, and as he walked off through the property, he hid the pickaxe under bushes before making his way back to his father's home in Sydney. Now, Grant Clark had returned early enough to save his son, but unfortunately not his wife, who was pronounced dead at the hospital only 90 minutes after Paul Mason had entered their home. And for the next couple of months, Mason thought he'd gotten away with murder. For a while, he stayed in Riverstone in Sydney, but in July of 1989, Mason began to spend time at a cottage that his father owned in Eden, a suburb about 20 minutes away from where Ruth and Mark Ferguson were murdered. By tracing purchases that he had made before leaving Sydney, detectives found that Mason had purchased the mountain climber's pickaxe that was found at the Ferguson crime scene, as well as a large sporting bag, ropes, knives, different rolls of tape, a bow and arrows, and a .303 rifle. Now, Paul Mason had gone to school with Ruth, and his sister had been a bridesmaid at Ruth and Greg's wedding, so Mason knew that he would be welcomed into this family home, no questions asked, and he would be trusted alone with Ruth and 8-month-old Mark. At 8:30 a.m. on the 27th of July, he surprised the Fergusons with a visit after deciding to drive to their house from Eden after having a beer that morning. He had timed it well. Greg Ferguson was on his way out to work just as Mason arrived at the home. Paul and Greg exchanged polite greetings, and Greg apologized for not being able to stay and catch up, but he had to get to work. Mason watched him leave before turning his attention to Ruth. Ruth Ferguson and Paul Mason spent an hour or so catching up, Ruth pulling out photo albums to share with her old friend Paul. Paul Mason's police statement said that he had come up behind Ruth while she was in the kitchen. She had gone to mix something up in the blender, he said. He had then pulled out a sheath knife that he had stashed in his backpack that he had brought with him, and he'd put the large knife against her throat. He told Ruth that it was a very sharp knife, and this was serious. He led her out into the hall and ordered her to lie down. Ruth was frightened. This was someone that she knew and trusted. She tried to plead with him, told him that he hadn't done anything wrong yet, he could just leave and everything would be fine. Paul Mason threatened her again with the knife if she didn't do what he said, and after she lay down in the hall, he pulled rope from his pocket and proceeded to bind Ruth's hands together. He then pulled out some tape and taped her mouth shut, before then using more rope to tie her legs together. Now that's when, Paul Mason told police, he heard the baby. Now, fair warning, I'm going to describe the circumstances of Mark Ferguson's death, so if you're not up to hearing that, maybe skip ahead 30 seconds or so. Okay, so Paul Mason heard Mark making noise. He said, quote, "The baby made loud noises, so I strangled it." At first he had used his hands, but he said the baby kept wanting to recover, so he had not only tightened the bib that Mark was wearing around his neck, but also went and got thicker rope that he'd also brought with him to use to strangle Mark to death. He then returned to the woman tied up on the floor. Ruth struggled against the ropes tying her hands and legs together. Paul Mason told police that at that point, he took off his pants and had sex with her. He had raped Ruth Ferguson after tying her up and murdering her baby. During this assault, Ruth had managed to get some of the rope off her legs and ran partway down the hall, but she had been terrified and disoriented and had run into one of the walls. Mason managed to retie her and carried her through the house. He told the police that he had said to her he was just going to put her in the boot of the car and then he'd bring Mark down to be with her. When he eventually got Ruth down to the car and then managed to get her into the boot, he then pulled out the pickaxe and began a frenzied attack on Ruth, focusing the blows to her head. His statement to police says, quote, "I think I probably hit her several times. There could have been more glancing to her head. I tried to do it quickly and put as much force as possible into each blow to end it as quick as possible, but she kept screaming during the first few, and when I stopped hitting her, she gave one more moan and was quiet." He also said that they would most likely find rope burns on her limbs and bruising and other injuries because she'd run into the wall, and he had said, quote, "When I put her in the boot, I did it pretty roughly." Now, after waiting until he was absolutely sure that Ruth was dead, he made his way back into the house to get the body of Mark Ferguson. He brought the baby out to the car and placed him into the trunk next to his mother. Paul Mason then closed the lid on the mother and son who he had so violently just murdered. He told police that he'd been planning this murder for weeks. He'd been observing the home, learning the routines of Greg and Ruth. He knew where they went, what they did. He knew what time Greg left for work. He told the investigators that he'd felt the same as he had the first time he'd committed murder. He'd just simply felt the urge to kill. He seemed to express no remorse over what he had done to Mary Clark and her unborn child, and Ruth and Mark Ferguson. He also didn't seem to feel any guilt about it. He was simply stating the facts of his actions to the investigators. It made the detectives wonder why Mason had just handed himself in of his own accord. It didn't seem to be because he felt bad about what he'd done. Maybe he was self-aware enough to know that he wouldn't be able to stop himself acting on the urge to kill if it happened to come about again. On the 30th of July, 1989, Paul Gerald Mason was charged with 3 counts of murder for Mary Alice Clark and Ruth and Mark Ferguson, and 1 count of attempted murder for Samuel Clark. The following day, Paul Mason faced the local court. He entered no plea and no bail was requested, so the hearing was adjourned and he was held in custody until the 14th of August. The media had swarmed to the Queanbeyan police station after the arrest, and when detectives addressed the reporters in a press conference, Detective Sergeant Len Dean told them that Paul Mason had admitted to the murders of Mary Clark, Ruth Ferguson, and Mark Ferguson. Now, this statement, made to the media before Mason had ever appeared in court, along with footage of Paul Mason and police officers visiting the crime scenes and Mason's reconstructions of the crimes, had been published through various media channels, including the 7 and 10 networks, and this would go on to have its own legal consequences. Paul Mason was back in court on August 14, 1989, where it was ruled that he would face committal proceedings for the triple murder and attempted murder charges. He was ordered to appear back in the Queanbeyan local court on October 16th to have a committal hearing date decided. Until then, though, he was remanded in the Goulburn jail. Now, Paul Gerald Mason was classified as a strict protection prisoner, and he was held in protective custody and completely separated from other prisoners. Mason would be likely to face severe physical trauma or prison justice at the hands of other prisoners as punishment for killing a child, or 2 if you include the Clark's unborn child that died when he killed Mary Alice Clark. Mason was expected to stay in this separated solitary cell for the next 2 months until he faced court again. But Paul Gerald Mason would never make it to his next court date. At 3:45 p.m. on the 10th of September 1989, guards checked on Mason and closed and locked his cell overnight. At 7:07 a.m. on the morning of the 11th, a prison officer went to check in on Mason for the morning, and found him in his cell, dead. Paul Mason had used his own bedsheets and had hanged himself by tying them to the bars in his prison cell window. He had decided that death was preferable over taking responsibility for his actions. The Clark and Ferguson families felt like they would never see justice for the brutal murders of their loved ones. But Mr. Kevin Waller, the state coroner, held a coronial inquest into the deaths of Mary Clark, Ruth Ferguson, and Mark Ferguson. Now, Paul Mason had actually left a note to the coroner in his cell. There's no record of the contents, but the comments made by Waller at the inquest gave some insight into the character of Mason. Waller said, quote, "Mason has never expressed sorrow for his victims or their families. He has expressed regret for the situation in which he last found himself, jail, but I've never heard anything given that he ever expressed a single word of sorrow for Mary Clark, Ruth Ferguson, or Mark Ferguson, or the devastation that he's caused to the families of those people." Waller expressed his compassion for the Clark and Ferguson families, who had to suffer from not only the loss of Mary, Ruth, and Mark, but had now also been stripped of their opportunity to see Mason face trial for what he'd done. Waller eventually found that each victim's death was due to the effects of the injuries delivered by Paul Gerald Mason. It had now been legally recognized that Mason had killed all 3. It was no longer alleged, he was officially guilty. Waller added that, quote, "Despite Mason saying that he intended to kill the whole Clark family, including Grant, he was apparently afraid to confront a man with such violence." Now, the families of Mary Alice Clark and Ruth and Mark Ferguson found some small measure of closure after the inquest, and although the guilty decision would never bring their loved ones back, it did take away any doubt of the perpetrator in these gruesome and violent crimes. While Paul Gerald Mason had been awaiting his court appearance, one he would never attend, an internal police investigation had been launched into the handling of Mason's arrest and charges. Now, this investigation was due to the comments made by detectives before Mason had ever appeared in court for the first time, and the subsequent media coverage of not only interviews with Mason and detectives, but also footage of Mason being escorted around the crime scene. The investigation aimed to determine if the handling of the case and the media surrounding Paul Mason could have possibly made a fair trial impossible. Now, there were also allegations that the plane that had picked up Mason and officers after visiting the Oakdale Farm cottage and retrieving the murder weapon and taking them to Pambula Beach was chartered by the Channel 7 network, and as such they were able to interview Mason and obtain footage of the crime scenes. In April of 1990, almost a year after Paul Mason had committed his first murder, the New South Wales Attorney General, John Down, summonised 5 media organisations that had broadcast the Mason details before a trial was held, potentially solidifying his guilt to the community that would create unfair bias against Mason if he stood trial for his charges. The media organisations that were charged with contempt of court were Channel 7, Channel 9, Channel 10, the ABC, and Nationwide News Proprietary Limited, which was a subsidiary of News Corp. Also brought before a judge on contempt of court orders was Detective Sergeant Len Dean for the public comments he'd made regarding Mason's admission of guilt. Now, all 5 media outlets were found guilty of contempt of court. Some had pled guilty, and others had continually denied that their coverage of the story could prejudice a trial. The Daily Telegraph claimed that their report ran due to an embarrassing mistake by one of their experienced solicitors, who had actually advised them that the report would not be in contempt of court. The Daily Mirror was said to have featured the article simply in reckless pursuit of a good story and sales. The parent company of these 2 papers, Nationwide News, was fined a total of $200,000. Now, Channel 10 claimed that although they did have a system of legal checks in place for stories of this nature, this foolproof system had broken down on this one occasion. They attempted to avoid any monetary fines, claiming that being in receivership at the time, they didn't have the capital to pay a fine, but the judges weren't convinced. They said that they were, quote, "not persuaded by the financial information put before us should have any effect on the outcome of the matter." As the channel might have been in receivership, but it was not in liquidation, they were fined $75,000. Now, the ABC, while not explaining how the reports came to be broadcast on the network, did plead guilty to the contempt of court charges and were fined $120,000, after the judges inferred that whoever had been involved in publishing it knew that there was a risk of contempt, but was prepared to run that risk. The judges commented on Channel 7's role in the charges. They had been the company to allegedly provide the means of transport when Mason was moved, as well as capture footage of Mason reenacting the crimes at the murder scenes. Channel 7, said the judges, was more concerned about the risk to which they'd been exposed themselves, and not for the actual damage that may have been done to others by the broadcast. They were fined $200,000. All 5 organisations were found to have broadcast on television matter which was likely or calculated or had a tendency to interfere with the administration of justice in connection with the trial of Paul Gerald Mason on 3 charges of murder and 1 charge of attempted murder. Detective Len Dean was also found guilty of contempt of court, but consideration was made of the long hours he'd worked on this case, his long career with the police force, and the issues surrounding media relations policies within the police force at the time. Detective Sergeant Dean was not fined by the court, but he and his co-defendants were made to pay damages to the New South Wales Attorney General for the costs of bringing the prosecution. Now, Detective Sergeant Leonard Dean had a fatal heart attack only weeks after this decision. His friends suggested that the long hours of police duty, his tireless and earnest work on the Mason cases, and the effect of having charges brought against him and being found guilty had exacerbated his condition and had caused Len Dean's death. He had helped to chase and catch a serial killer who had murdered 2 women with a pickaxe and had killed 1 child and almost killed another. He had made a simple statement to the media after Paul Mason confessed to the murders, and for a year he was dragged through the court system to face charges for that one statement. He had worked tirelessly for months before Mason surrendered, and it was speculated that this stress had caused the heart attack that tragically killed him. Now, I have no doubt that if Paul Gerald Mason had not been in custody or jail, he would have killed more people. I think that he killed Mary Alice Clark because she had rejected his sexual advances. He picked up a weapon that was handy while he was hiding in the hay shed, and then he purposefully waited for Grant to leave. I think he wanted to catch Mary Alice Clark alone, no matter how much he claims he was planning to kill Grant as well. I think he thought that she would be the easier target. He didn't want to have to work too hard for it, because he's a dickhead. He viciously bludgeoned her with a pickaxe and then attempted to smother her 1-year-old son before just running away. He told police officers that he'd just gotten the urge to kill. There was no evidence that he'd made the same advances towards Ruth as he had towards Mary. Maybe he just liked doing it so much the first time that he wanted to do it again. But that's scary as shit, because that means that there's no motive. He could kill anyone at any time for anything. Now, at that point, he thought he'd committed the perfect murder. No one was looking for him, the police didn't have any solid leads, and he was in Sydney, far away from the crime scene. And he must have wanted to recreate his first murder with his second and third, because he went and purchased the same weapon that he'd used in the Mary Alice Clark murder, and he also chose victims that matched the Clark households, Greg, Ruth, and baby Mark. But this time he wouldn't leave the baby alive, and he would also leave the weapon in the boot of the car with both of his victims. I mean, there is a chance that he wanted to be caught because he knew he couldn't control this urge to kill, so he turned himself in. And then maybe he realized the gravity of what he'd done and the prison cell he now faced for potentially the rest of his life, and got the urge to kill once more, but this time he'd be his own victim. Now, in all of the commotion surrounding the charges brought against the large media companies, the fact that Mary Alice Clark and Ruth Ferguson were brutally attacked with a pickaxe until they died, Ruth being raped before she was subjected to this physical assault, and that an 8-month-old baby had been strangled to death, with another 1-year-old only narrowly escaping being smothered, seemed to just be forgotten by everyone. The Clark and Ferguson families were devastated by their losses, and Samuel Clark will grow up knowing that he almost died and his mother was savagely murdered on his birthday. Those families will never forget the impact that Mason had on them, and they will always know that he is guilty of this crime. And that, friends, is the case of the Pickaxe Killer Paul Gerald Mason and his victims Mary Alice Clark, Ruth Ferguson, and Mark Ferguson. Now, as much as I wish Mason could have faced trial and perhaps justice for his crimes, I can't really say that I'm super cut up that he's not around anymore. But that's it, that's the case. Such a short one. If I had more information, I would give it to you. There's not even a book I can recommend. There is a story in a book, in an anthology of crime cases, so I will link that in the description, and a couple of news articles if you guys want to read them, but it was super difficult to find information on this case, and I think it's probably because Mason did kill himself, and so there's not really a lot of opportunity to go through a trial or to get his version of events. There was only the statements that were given to the police. So yeah, I will link everything in the description box below if you want to have a look. And I will be back with another Australian true crime case, so I hope to see you on the next episode. But until then, be good, be safe, and don't murder anyone. Bye.